Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. As you know by now, I am a big enthusiast of the Nobel Prize in Literature, and I have read at least one book by every Nobel laureate, which is an experience or a reading journey that I have been sharing with you here for quite a while now. Every year, when October comes, I am there early in the morning waiting for the announcement. And on a couple of occasions, I have even gone as far as to listen to the announcement in Swedish so that I can hear it first and go to the website for my library and place holds on the books that I am interested in reading, which is what I did this year. I am ashamed to admit that I had not heard of Han Kang before. So, on the other hand, that is not really that surprising because most of the authors that I read, I will admit, are actually dead. So that's another story. But when I read about her, I'm going to tell you, I was genuinely interested in her work, just beyond the fact that she had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. So now I have read her, I have loved what I read, and here I am ready to share with you my impressions on her work. So the first thing I want to do is I want to share with you the Nobel Prize citation because I think that's important. So Han Kang was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, quote, for her intense poetic prose that confronts historical traumas and exposes the fragility of human life. As tends to be the case, this is packed with important words, with key words. We have poetic prose, not only poetic prose, but intense poetic prose, historical traumas, the fragility of human life. And actually, Han Kang has said that her novels explore human suffering. So you can expect some heavy themes, some themes that are difficult to deal with. I want to show you some of her books, and I'm going to start with her most famous one, which is by far The Vegetarian. This one is from 2007, and as the title indicates, it is the story of a woman who decides to become a vegetarian, and it traces the effects that this has on her and also on the people around her. Many readers have compared this novel, at least, or drawn a parallel with the work of Franz Kafka. I am sure they're thinking primarily of the Metamorphosis because you have a similar idea right there at the center, right? This idea of a person who undergoes a drastic change and the effects of that and how people around them react. Then we have Human Acts. This one is from 2014. It is about the killing of a 15-year-old boy during protests that happened in 1980. So this is the one that we will be exploring, so I'm going to tell you a lot more about this one shortly. And then I also wanted to mention Greek Lessons. This is from the year 2011. It's the story of a woman who loses her ability to speak, and at the same time she's taking Greek lessons, and the teacher is losing his sight. He's going blind. So they bond over this personal difficulty that they are experiencing. And I managed to find that last one in Spanish also, La Clase de Griego. So I'm happy that I will hopefully get the chance to read Han Kang in both of the major languages that I can read in. But as I told you before, we are going to be focusing on Human Acts. Okay, this is the one that I chose. I'm going to tell you, of course, why it is that I chose this one too. So the original title is not Human Acts. It is The Boy is Coming or Here Comes the Boy, depending on how you translate it. This is a novel, okay? It's a novel that is based on historical events, but the genre is novel. And the main topic, or the main theme, I would say, is life under a dictatorship. I know if you have read this book, you are probably thinking that is simplistic to reduce the entire book to that simple phrase, and of course it is, but that is the main concept that we have at the center of this book. And the historical background for it is the Gwangju uprising, which happened in May of 1980. This is a historical event very important in the history of Korea, in which many people who were simply wanted their rights to be respected were brutally killed, imprisoned, wounded, tortured, all that you can imagine. The number of people who were killed actually is not even certain. We do not know for sure, but different sources estimate between 1,000 people and 2,000. Of course, the official story is very different when you look at the numbers, as tends to happen in these cases. There are many films that deal directly or indirectly with this event, but probably the most famous one is A Taxi Driver. This is a movie from 2017 by the director Hun Jang. So it stars the same actor who plays the protagonist in Parasite, and he was also in Memories of Murder. So, we have some really, really great talent here. But anyway, why did I choose Human Acts? The reason why I chose this novel is because I wanted to read about a historical event in Korean history, as opposed to something more psychological. I think here what you get is creative nonfiction. It's fact and also fiction in a sense. So I was attracted to that as maybe, providing the best of both worlds, if you want to look at it that way. So I'm going to tell you now a little bit about the structure and about the style. This novel is 220 pages long, and it is divided into 6 chapters, and it also has an epilogue. So we get a multi-perspective narrative for the most part. We have an episodic novel. It is narrated by different characters, and it covers a period of 33 years. So yes, it is the story of this boy who was killed, or at least at the center you have the figure of this 15-year-old boy. But it's not going to tell you the story of what happened to that boy from beginning to end in a linear fashion. For the most part, it's an approximation to the Gwangju uprising from different perspectives, as I said, but you don't really get a lot of information about the boy for reasons that the novel explains too. And regarding the style, I would describe it as the poetic description of horror. This is one of the trademarks of the style of Hankang. There's a prominent use of the second person. When you start the novel, like at the very beginning, you're going to notice the second person is used a lot. And of course, one of the obvious effects of that is that it puts you right there. You feel as if you were right there where the events happened. I wanted to tell you about the characters, but I thought one way of doing that is a lot better is actually to look at the contents of the novel, because each chapter focuses or is narrated by one of these characters. So I thought that would be a best way to look at the people who are involved in the narrative. Chapter 1, which is titled The Boy 1980, each chapter, by the way, has a year to it, so that it tells you, and you can place yourself historically in what is happening. So The Boy 1980. And the novel begins with the figure of Dong-ho, who is the boy, the 15-year-old boy, who ends up almost by mistake, almost not knowing how it happened, helping at the provincial office with the identification of corpses. The novel begins with the image of dead people. That is one of the reasons why the translator Deborah Smith, in her introduction to the novel, makes a comparison with Antigone that I think is actually quite apt and quite effective. So he's helping with this identification of bodies, and the prevalent theme or the how would I call it, the emotion maybe, that you can find in this first chapter is the sense of guilt that he has. So if I had to pinpoint one theme of this chapter, that's the one that I would say is the most important one. And there's a preoccupation that he has with souls, and that is very important because it's a recurring theme that you're going to find throughout this novel, this idea of what is the soul, what happens to souls, those kinds of questions. And if you go to page 52, actually, there are some questions here that are voiced by this character. How long do souls linger by the side of their bodies? Do they really flutter away like some kind of bird? Is that what trembles the edges of the candle flame? So souls are shown or are described as birds. That's why you have the figure of this bird right here in the cover. It really mirrors what happens in the book. Now the second chapter moves on to The Boy's Friend. That is the title, also 1980. And it deals with Dong-ho's friend. They were pretty close, they were classmates. And he is presented as a soul clinging to a dead body. Like, how long, the question is here, can the soul cling to the body of a person who is not there anymore? And in this chapter, I found the events, of course, to be horrific, but the style is quite poetic. So you get that contrast right there that, as I told you before, is one of the trademarks of the style of Hankang. Then chapter 3 is titled The Editor 1985. So we move a little bit forward in time. And the editor in this case is a woman who is in charge of dealing with the censors. Whenever there is a book in the publishing house that is about to be published. So it has to go through this process because we are dealing with a dictatorship and there has to be permission to publish these texts. And the character who's at the center of this chapter is basically the person who deals with that. Now, the event here, the central one, is that during an interrogation, she is brutally slapped 7 times. So the chapter traces her attempts to forget each one of those slaps, one by one. So you see what happens. There's a big sense of humiliation here in this chapter. It's really, really terrible, the psychological horror of what this woman goes through. Then after that, chapter 4 is titled The Prisoner, 1990. So we keep moving forward a little bit in history. And in this chapter, what we get is detailed descriptions of the tortures undergone by the prisoners during this time in history. And the important thing about this one, the important thing to understand, I would say, is that this chapter, chapter 4, The Prisoner, happens exactly in the midpoint of the novel. So you could say that it is literally central to the events that we are hearing about. And what we hear primarily is how dictatorships basically reduce the human person to a body, or as it is referred to in the text, a lump of meat. There's a very important passage here on page 139 that also presents a series of questions that I thought were interesting. So let me read you that. Is it true that human beings are fundamentally cruel? Is the experience of cruelty the only thing we share as a species? Is the dignity that we cling to nothing but self-delusion, masking from ourselves this single truth, that each one of us is capable of being reduced to an insect, a ravening beast, a lump of meat, to be degraded, damaged, slaughtered? Is this the essential fate of humankind, one that history has confirmed as inevitable? All of these are very important questions to the novel, and they're questions that, of course, they do not have easy answers, and the novel does not provide those easy answers. So it's more about asking the questions. We're going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to the final part of this video. Chapter 5 is titled The Factory Girl. This one happens in the year 2002. It's about a woman who had been in prison, and she is contacted by a reporter who wants her testimony about the events that happened back in those days in the early 1980s. So this chapter shows the courage of the women who were involved in the protests and in the struggle. And the interesting thing about it from the point of view of style is that the narrative alternates between present, past, and then there's also a kind of interior monologue that we are presented with here. It's very effective how these are intertwined. Now, the reporter, interestingly, is a recurring character. It's a character that we know from a previous chapter. So one of the interesting things about this novel is that as you read it, you start to realize how the destinies of all these characters are very closely interwoven, intertwined. They're all connected. That's one of the neat things stylistically about this text. And then finally we get to chapter 6, which is the final chapter per se, which is titled The Mother 2010. So we are now, closer to the time of publication of the novel, which was 2014. And here we get to hear the voice of the boy's mother, right? So it really drives the narrative home, literally speaking. It's a chapter that has a tone that is quite homely in a good way. It's colloquial. So for that reason, the translator tells us in the introduction that this was the chapter that was the most difficult to translate, because it's very difficult to capture that local dialect, that local way of speaking when you're trying to translate something into another language. After that, this is also crucial, we get an epilogue, okay? And the epilogue is titled The Writer 2013. Why is this crucial? Well, what Han Kang does here is that she includes herself in the narrative. She enters this world. It's not really a fictional world because she's talking about historical events, about things that really happened, devastating events. And she also tells us how it was that she came to write the book. She was 9 years old when the Gwangju uprising happened, and she had just moved to Suyuri, which is a suburb of Seoul. So she was actually from Gwangju. She was born there. So you come to see how the history was connected also to her personal story. And that's where she tells us why it was and how it was that she came to write about these events that we hear about in this great novel, Human Acts. Now, as I read the novel, this is part of my personal reaction to it, I thought to myself, I could really be reading about Argentina in the late 1970s. Okay, this is a novel that I would describe as unfortunately universal, because no matter how much the circumstances may change, you can change the names of this novel, and basically it would be about any dictatorship that might have happened anywhere in the world. That's why I mean this is unfortunately universal. The descriptions of oppression and of torture reminded me of a book. This is a report, it's famous in Argentina, Nunca Más, or Never Again, about the disappeared people in Argentina. By the way, the face behind this, the president of the commission that put this together, was Ernesto Sábato. I have told you about his novel El Túnel, but that's beside the point. The idea here is that I kept thinking about this. You know, the descriptions were very similar to the ones that you may find in this book. This is a very difficult book to read, and actually when they were conducting the the judgment of the people who were involved in the tortures, the trials, that's the word that I'm looking for. The typists, they had to leave, and new ones had to come in because it was just so difficult to take and to hear what was being described. So you find the same brutality, the same pain, the same uncertainty about the actual number of people who were killed, the same suffering, the same lack of answers, So that's what I mean when I say, unfortunately, this is a novel that many people will be able to identify with, even if they did not grow up in Korea. Now, in terms of the Nobel Prize, right, in this other context, beyond the history, there were two connections that I made immediately as I was reading this novel. The first one was with Herta Müller, who also described in poetic terms life under dictatorships. And I think a great example of that is this novel right here, The Land of Green Plums, which I will definitely tell you about one of these days. So that was one connection that I made. But I also thought about a book by Patrick Modiano, and that is this one right here, Dora Bruder. This one is also about a missing person. So it revolves around the idea of a person that is missing, around the search, around the mystery, if you will, historical mystery. So in both cases, in the case of Human Acts and also in the case of Dora Bruder, you have the concept of a void at the center of the text, at the core of the narrative, something that is just ungraspable ultimately. So the bottom line, reading Human Acts is just, or was, a harrowing experience that I'm glad I had. I feel that I am a better person for having read this book. I have a better example of the things that human beings are capable of, not only the brutality, but also the moments of compassion that you can find here, and the pain, right, which is something that always helps you to maybe develop a little bit more of empathy, which is something that I feel that all of us need in some level or another. It's a great example, this novel, of how through language we can approach at least something that is ultimately beyond language. Horror that is literally unspeakable. It is something that language can never describe. So basically we have this void, this empty space at the center, and what language can do is just try to approach that, and it would always stay around that void, because as I said, what is right there in the center is ultimately beyond words, because it is so difficult to describe. So I would say, if you're looking for something psychological, and if you want to read Han Kang, what I would do is I would go for The Vegetarian, her most famous novel, or you could also try Greek Lessons. That is, once again, if you're looking for something psychological, something, as we say in Spanish, and I believe in French there's an equivalent term, intimista, right? So that's the kind of thing that you'll find there. Human Acts is for those who are looking for a more testimonial, historical type of narrative, and I think in that case, if you're looking for that, it's not going to disappoint you. I'm definitely going to keep reading Han Kang. One thing that I want to do, and probably the next step for me is, as I suggested before, is I would like to read Greek Lessons, La Clase de Griego, but in Spanish, just to get that idea, to get the sense of how Han Kang sounds in my native language. So I may do a video on that. If I do it, it's going to be in Spanish, of course, so be on the lookout for that. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. I'm always here and I'm always listening. Those were my 2 cents on Human Acts by Han Kang. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.